Susan, welcome back into the back room.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be with you.
So I want to start off and talk about your two latest New Yorker pieces. Last week, you wrote a piece called On Trump, Gaza, and the Perils of a Blank Check for Israel. Tell me about the blank check.
Yeah, I think it's really remarkable because so much of the commentary, as we've seen these horrific images recently coming out of Gaza, of starving kids and the utter destruction of the Gaza Strip, you have this sort of he's up, he's down kind of commentary, colored commentary about Donald Trump. And, oh, is this a break with Netanyahu? Is this, some kind of a new policy that we're seeing from the Trump administration? And, I think that's one of the ways in which the president often gets the benefit of the doubt, rather than looking at the continuity of his actions over these last 6 months and the fact that, if anything, he bears a significant amount of the responsibility for this latest round of hunger inside Gaza, because when Netanyahu withdrew from the ceasefire almost unilaterally in March and imposed a near total blockade on food aid in Israel, the United States, as you know, has an outsized say in Israeli security matters because it is an outsized contributor to Israel's security. And you didn't hear a word from Donald Trump about this blockade of aid. In fact, they set up a new, very dysfunctional, broken system of food distribution that was a partnership between the United States and Israel, and it didn't work. And that is one of the reasons we're seeing this crisis unfold right now. So again, I just, obviously the responsibility is Israel's, it's Netanyahu's for his own policy, but there's such a deep intertwining at this point between the politics of the Republican Party and the fortunes and the politics of Netanyahu's government. And I feel like that was just sort of missing from the conversation in many ways.
It's an interesting thing to think about when you factor in single issue American Jews back in November. And just for the record, I want to establish I am a Jew, but there were a lot of single issue Trump supporters in the Jewish community. And I'm wondering if they can get beyond the psychology of it. Trump supports Israel. Trump is very pro-Israel, and actually think about it. His policies, his behavior, his rhetoric has, I think, been a disaster for Israel.
Yeah, it's interesting you make that point. I actually spoke with Dan Shapiro, the former U.S. ambassador to Israel during the Obama administration. Then during the Biden administration, he was a senior official at the Pentagon in the wake of October 7th, working on the U.S. and Middle East security issues. Dan is a very thoughtful observer, by the way, a very pro-Israel Democrat. And he was the one who used the phrase about Trump's, the responsibility that he bears in part because of the backlash that Israel is now facing. That, whether you are right wing or left wing supporter of Israel at this point, this doesn't look like it is a politically beneficial move. And yet, let's level set that we're having this conversation when Israel's poised on the brink of actually escalating the conflict even more in Gaza. And one of the important points that Dan, the former ambassador, made to me that I think, again, gets lost in a lot of the very rhetorical conversation about this right now is that Trump's own rhetoric about essentially depopulating Gaza, taking all the Gazans out of Gaza and turning it into some kind of a Riviera of the Middle East with golden Trump casinos. Remember all that? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Not only was that wildly naive, but Dan's point to me, which I think is really important to underscore, is that Trump was giving, in effect, a permission slip to very extreme parts of the Netanyahu political coalition, who that's exactly their goal is, in effect, depopulation of Gaza, reannexation of it, and, some kind of nebulous but massive sweeping transformation of the enclave. And, Trump has never retracted this proposal. He doesn't talk about it anymore. Of course, most people rolled their eyes, thought this is absurd, it's embarrassing, it's ridiculous for a president of the United States to say something so naive. But I think beyond the kind of surface naivete of, the ignorant real estate developer proclaiming that he's going to redevelop this horrific war zone in the middle of the war, I think there's something actually even more nefarious at work here, which is it's the enabling of extremism. And again, from my perspective, that's part of the question of the blank check.
Hmm.
When you have essentially one of America's two political parties, the Republican Party, has become almost an uncritical supporter of Israel, no matter what it does, a kind of a restraint both on Israel's actions, but also in our politics has been lifted. And I think we're seeing some pretty bad results of that, not only for the Palestinian people, not only for the people in Gaza who are desperate as people in Israel are for the war to end, but also for Israel itself. It's hard to see what the long-term benefits for the country are of this kind of political isolation, losing of people who have previously been supporters and allies for Israel, and they're just throwing up their hands and saying, this is some kind of a Trump Netanyahu nexus, and what can we, do? It's extremism in a different form.
Yeah. You suggest in your piece that Trump's flip-flopping on foreign policy with regards to Israel is, at least in large part, based on the images he sees when watching TV. I suppose the same holds true for his domestic policy decisions, but with a constantly changing news cycle, how dangerous is that?
Yeah, I thank you for flagging that, because I do think that the other way to look at the last week is as a classic example of the kind of self-reinforcing media feedback loop in which Trump exists, which is to say he's watching TV, consuming pictures, reacting to the pictures, creating policy based on visceral experiences. People have had a tendency to misread his reactions to these pictures as new foreign policy doctrine since the minute that Trump first became president 8 years ago. And all last week, when this was playing out with Gaza, and there was all this kind of breathless commentary on all cable networks, right, left, and center, about, oh, is this a break with Netanyahu? I found myself having a flashback to the spring of 2017 when Donald Trump first became president. And what did he do? He launched an airstrike, but essentially a one-off type airstrike against Syria, because he was reacting to horrific pictures on television of children suffering after a chemical weapons attack in Syria. And oh my goodness, there was so much misinterpretation, so many knowledgeable pundits, Fareed Zakaria, saying this is the beginning of, a new Trump presidency. He's finally decided to play a leadership role in the world. This is the Trump doctrine. And, his own advisors were stoking this. They actually, the thing I remember about that incident, among other things, was that they were in Mar-a-Lago when Trump decided to launch this what turned off to be essentially one-off airstrike on Syria in response to TV pictures. His advisors staged a photo op in Mar-a-Lago designed to look like the famous photo op of Barack Obama and his top national security officials watching the Osama bin Laden raid. And, to, create this image of this sort of heroic, decisive wartime leader. And again, it was a picture in response to a picture, sound and fury, signifying pretty much as close to nothing as a missile strike can signal. And I thought about that all last week. I hope that, your listeners will bear that in mind when they hear future pundits declaring, this or that new Trump foreign policy doctrine.
So he promised to end the Israel-Hamas war day one, which was kind of suspect to me because I thought Jared Kushner brought peace to the Middle East 7 years ago. But I guess that's besides the point. There's a line in your piece, which I love. Quote, wars, it turns out, do not end magically because Trump clicks his heels and demands that they do so. Do you think he's finally realizing that? Or did he know that all along and he's just willfully lying to his base? That's the big question, isn't it?
Well, look, I mean, remember Donald Trump's whole life, his personal life, his business life, before he became president, his political life. It's all about creating uh, or projecting a reality that doesn't exist, and then seeing how far you and others, and you can get others to go along with it. And I think that has been his approach to foreign policy, as it has been his approach to so many things. Um, One of the things that's happening is that there's a real world that exists, and it's a lot easier to be a candidate for office, a campaigner, trashing other people for their failures than it is to bear responsibility of any kind. And sooner or later, you put too many balls in the air, and they start to fall down. And I think that that's the other way of looking at what's happening with Trump and Gaza, is in the context of a whole bunch of transformative promises about the world that are almost impossible to collect upon. And, remember that he was also going to end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, or even at one point, he said even before he became the president. And, there is the element of magical thinking that goes into the power projection of the White House, right? That's his one play. He doesn't have that many plays in his playbook. And the play in the playbook is to basically bluster, seek leverage, huff and puff, and hope that somebody kind of buys it, basically. And, when you're dealing with these very intractable issues, that's very hard to see. Even on the trade and tariff stuff, again, the idea that a single man is going to transform the global economy through sheer force of will. It is a remarkably audacious way of viewing the American presidency, but it's also a recipe for broken expectations between the sort of electorate that goes along with those outsized promises, and what anyone can deliver on. And I think 6 months in, we're kind of seeing this moment of like, well, what do you do when the magic doesn't work? The Wizard of Oz doesn't just come out behind the curtain and say, oh, sorry guys, I lied. He's gonna keep looking for a new way to stay behind the curtain and to keep his followers believing that he's the wizard, even if he's not actually a magician.
Do you think we are at an inflection point here in the United States with this war and how it's being prosecuted? Because there are Jews like me who stood with Israel after October 7th for the longest time, but are now saying enough is enough.
Yeah, I mean, look, it feels like at this point there's been a break. That's a very significant break among Democratic, capital D, supporters of Israel in the United States. And that this is many years in coming. And by the way, it actually predates Trump in many ways. Netanyahu, even more than Trump, is the architect of this rift. He chose in many ways to put the future of Israel in the hands of one of our two political parties. There were many people at the time inside Israel, inside the United States, who warned Netanyahu about the consequences of politicizing Israel in an American political context. I remember very vividly when he came to the United States to campaign against Obama's Iran nuclear deal, and he chose and was given a forum to speak before the Republican-led Congress. And that was the moment for me that was like a very significant breach that was going to change the nature of Israel's political standing inside the United States. And I think the bill for that is now coming due here. And, it seems to me what you're also seeing is a recognition by Netanyahu and his advisors that, those Democrats like you may be lost for the long term. And they're not even trying in a way to get that support back right now. I'm really struck by that. And again, the context for this conversation that we're having is that Israel is about to have, as I understand from news reports, a significant cabinet meeting in which Netanyahu and some of his cabinet members are going to be pushing for an expansion of the war in Gaza. And, at this point, when they've resisted for so long, remember, October 7th, 2023, we're coming up on 2 years of the war. It's Israel's longest war already, I believe. And, they have refused to come up with and to articulate in public plans for what a day after scenario looks like. Why is that? Obviously, one explanation is because there's a vested interest in keeping the war going. Another explanation is because there is an agenda that they don't want to put out publicly that would involve possibly re-annexing and reoccupying Gaza. That there is no long-term Palestinian-led or Arab-led solution. That elements of this Israeli government might be willing to accept, and so. I think that is a very worrisome scenario for even people in the United States who reluctantly have continued to support Israel while having growing qualms about this war.
Yeah. There were some reports last week that some people in Trump's administration had been referring to Netanyahu as a, quote, madman. I mean, that's pretty stunning.
Well, I think many, many American presidents, because, Netanyahu is already essentially the longest serving modern leader of Israel. And he has infuriated interlocutors of both parties here in the United States, going all the way back to the beginning. Actually, in fact, my husband and I wrote a biography of former Secretary of State Jim Baker, who was the Secretary of State back in the George H.W. Bush presidency. And this is a little known episode, but it goes to your point about, frustration with Bibi being bipartisan. Baker actually banned Netanyahu from the State Department. At the time, Netanyahu was a young deputy foreign minister of Israel, and he infuriated Baker, the Secretary of State, by giving an interview and basically criticizing the United States on the record in this interview, and he made him persona non grata at the State Department, which was a big problem, for the peace efforts at the time. And his Baker's advisor spent like a year begging him to rescind this order, and he refused to do so. And he said, basically, as long as I'm the Secretary of State, this man is not stepping foot inside my department. So again, it's been a bipartisan phenomenon, frustration with Bibi. My husband, Peter Baker, tells the story of his first day on the White House beat as a relatively junior reporter back during Bill Clinton's presidency. Netanyahu was at the White House meeting with Clinton that day. By this point in his first term as prime minister, this is a famous meeting because it's the meeting that, according to subsequent reporting, is the meeting at which, after Netanyahu left, Bill Clinton said, "So who's the goddamn president of the United States here?" in this meeting.
Yeah, it's hard for me to escape the irony of people working for Trump saying that Netanyahu is a madman.
Well, there is that. Look, the answer is that he's not actually. He's a very calculating figure. It's Trump who has the history of being very undisciplined and erratic in his dealings, both in public and private, with world figures. And there's also some animosity between the two of them, which is, again, often overlooked because, the fusion between the Republican Party and Netanyahu and Israel has been so significant a political factor. I think we've tended to overlook there's also the personal factor. And actually, Trump was furious with Netanyahu at the end of his first term as president for two things. One, he was very angry when Netanyahu came to the White House to roll out, you mentioned Jared Kushner, to roll out his big peace plan, which ultimately, as we know, sadly didn't go anywhere. And Trump was really mad at Netanyahu for what he thought of as commandeering the White House podium and talking for too long and, just generally putting himself in the center of the spotlight. And we all know how Trump feels about being upstaged by anybody. And then he was mad at him his whole final year in office in 2020. But then he was really mad at him after the 2020 election when Netanyahu did what world leaders do and called to congratulate the winner of the American presidential election, Joe Biden. And of course, Trump wanted everyone to go along with his false claims of the rigged election, and he took it very personally with Bibi.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we can all say what we want about Netanyahu, but he does have an end game, and he is strategic in accomplishing that. Let's talk about your other recent piece, which is called Trump Redefines the Washington Scandal. You refer to Epstein Gate as a, quote, genuinely metastasizing scandal. Given all the lies, the gaslighting, and the many Trump scandals and conspiracies, why do you think this one is different? Why is this one on some level driving a serious wedge through MAGA?
It is, it's so, first of all, let's just stipulate, like, wouldn't it be great to be talking about anything else than this, right? Like
Yeah.
something that actually affected the lives of the American people, or, what is it that the Trump administration is doing that, is really disrupting key areas of our lives, of the country, of the US government, and so I find it very telling that this is the scandal that, has sort of consumed MAGA, that, and I wrote that a couple weeks ago, and the scandal has not ebbed away despite Trump's hopes, I think that it would, despite his many, many distractions, some of which seemed outright aimed at simply, distracting people from it. And, you know, first of all, it tells you about the power of conspiracy theories, I think, right? So, this was something that had been peddled by Trump, and in particular by some of his very top advisors, including his now director of the FBI, had been feeding this idea that not only was there some nefarious conspiracy involving a cover up of Jeffrey Epstein's death, but also the idea that celebrity Democrats and others were, in on the scam in some ways. And what Kash Patel, the director of the FBI, and others were dangling in front of Trump's MAGA supporters was that once they got power over the government, they were going to release these files, and they were going to, tell us the truth. And Trump, rather than shutting that down when he could have, encouraged it. And this is, in some level, kind of his own fire getting out of control and coming to burn him. So I think that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is that there is a genuine, what appears to be, cover up unfolding in front of us, and that is the ironclad kind of law of Washington scandal, right? And I've seen it. Democrats, Republicans, the cover up that ensues when you get embroiled in one of these things almost always is ultimately what trips up the politician in the center of a storm like this. And I think it's very notable, and certainly not just to MAGA, but, really to anybody who cares about the functioning of the government, to understand that in the last few months, Trump ordered a huge distortion of federal government resources. There were large numbers, possibly as many as hundreds of FBI agents and Justice Department officials combing through these documents in order to fulfill this campaign pledge. And then it abruptly stops. And, for the last couple months, basically, you're left to wonder, well, how many times is Trump's name in these documents? Donald Trump has said publicly, oh, no, my name wasn't in it. And no, I was not told by the attorney general that my name was in these documents. But in fact, reporting has shown that he was told by the attorney general that his name was in these documents. So, watch the cover up, number one. Watch how attached MAGA is to its kind of conspiracy theory view of Washington and of the world. I think these are kind of a fact of life that are with us as long as Trump is in power.
And, it's been reported in the last couple of days that at that Florida meeting with Todd Blanche and Ghislaine Maxwell, she said she had not seen Trump engage in any wrongdoing. So just to summarize, we have a convicted felon and adjudicated sexual abuser sends his former personal criminal defense attorney to meet with a convicted sex trafficker and indicted perjurer who wants clemency and or a pardon, and who doesn't say anything bad about the individual who is in absolute total control of her life, and then quickly gets sent to a cushy minimum security prison. What's wrong with this picture?
Shall we count the ways? I mean, I'm glad you highlighted the idea that Trump has made his own personal defense attorney the Deputy Attorney General of the United States. Because, again, looking for the bigger themes in all of this, the conflation of personal interest and the national interest is one of the hallmarks of Trump's time in office. The personalization of power and then the abuse of that power. I think that's a signature of his presidency, and it's particularly summed up in this uh, uh, move to send Todd Blanche to interview Ghislaine Maxwell. Lawyers who are familiar with the Justice Department, I mean, I've talked with them. I'm sure you have. Their head is like, spewing forth smoke and fire. They're practically, hyperventilating over the violation of what they consider to be ironclad norms here. Suffice it to say that it is unprecedented to have your own personal defense attorney be the Deputy Attorney General, and also
Mm-hmm.
any Deputy Attorney General, even the most scrupulously nonpartisan one, would never engage in an interview like this. That's just not how our justice system works. That's not how anybody should want our justice system to work. And I think that's the third kind of macro theme I see here, which is the hyper politicization of everything. Right? What Trump is out to do is to destroy the idea that there is anything neutral, independent, nonpartisan, take to the bank about our executive branch of government, that literally it is a personal fiefdom. And that is a radically different vision of the American presidency than that shared by really any of his modern predecessors.
And so now there's an emergency dinner taking place tonight called by J.D. Vance at his residence. And that's to include Attorney General Pam Bondi, FBI Director Kash Patel, Blanche, and Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, and others to discuss the Epstein messaging, which is really funny. I'll get to that in a second, and the strategy that they need to employ. And they'll also be discussing whether or not to release all or part of the transcripts of the Maxwell meeting with Todd Blanche. I want to know what you make of this, but isn't it also kind of deliciously ironic that all these people are going to get together to discuss the messaging strategy, and the guy they work for just vomits shit out like without any rhyme or reason, and almost always incriminates himself. So what could possibly come of this meeting?
Well, that's right. I mean, this is a classic Washington thing on some level, right? Like, no, folks, it's not a communications problem. It's not a messaging problem.
It's a
Donald
president problem.
Trump was friends for years with a revolting, horrible, sex predator. That's who he was friends with. And there's tons of pictures of the guy, including, as the New York Times featured just the other day, of him in his residence. It's the problem is Donald Trump's relationship and years of friendship with Jeffrey Epstein. That's the problem that they have. It's not a messaging problem. Number one. Number two, I do find it notable and should point out that J.D. Vance was one of the many now very, very senior officials in the U.S. government who was puffing up the Epstein conspiracy theories and promising the MAGA base that they were going to release these documents and, fueling this flames that now engulf Donald Trump. So J.D. Vance has a bit of a Donald Trump Epstein problem himself because, it's his own words that are being cited in part to demand that Donald Trump release the documents that he doesn't want to release. Number one. Number two, okay, let's just talk about the guest list there for a second. The inclusion of the FBI director in the middle of meetings like this is so wildly inappropriate. The inclusion of an attorney general in hyper-partisan environments, so wildly inappropriate. This is the inversion of the post-Watergate order of things. The idea that Americans came out of Watergate with, which is that, in fact, we should try to have a Justice Department that is insulated from partisan politics. That was one of the main takeaways of the Nixon era. And as always with Donald Trump, it's like he seems to see Richard Nixon not as a cautionary tale, but as the playbook for how he wants, Washington to work. But, where did Richard Nixon's attorney general and campaign chair, John Mitchell, end up? He ended up in jail. And, right now it looks like our system of, justice and accountability is so broken that these folks feel like there's that they have complete impunity. But to blur the lines of partisan politics and our justice system, and to have the FBI director in a meeting like this. And I don't like to go in for whataboutism, because I do feel like that's a game, that doesn't usually lead anywhere good. But I have to say, I have been thinking all week long, about Bill Clinton meeting for 5 minutes on the
The
tarmac with
tarmac,
then
right?
Attorney General Loretta Lynch, and the, hysterical cries of outrage that greeted that by Republicans. And here we have the Attorney General, the FBI director, in the middle of conversations about the political handling of a very serious sex trafficker like Ghislaine Maxwell, and thousands and thousands of pages of documents that have resulted from the investigation of her and her now dead co-conspirator.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to your point, it's not a normal administration meeting. It's not a normal senior official meeting. It's like a mob meeting. It's like the thing that took place upstate New York like 70 years ago, whatever. Like, these are capos getting together to discuss how to, insulate the Godfather and stay on point. It really is kind of crazy. But the last thing I want to ask you about, you wrote that this scandal is not about Trump's well-known friendship per se with the sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein or his nonstop lying, but rather that, quote, the novelty here is that millions of Americans who knew that Trump was friends with such a horrid man and voted for him anyway now appear to have decided that in a choice between Trump and a favorite conspiracy theory, they may just stick with the conspiracy theory. I really agree with you on that, and it really feels like that's happening. So it sounds like you believe this scandal is a real existential threat to Trump and perhaps even to Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is the most significant rift we've seen open up inside the MAGA base. And you have, some Republican members of Congress who've been absolutely refusing to break with Trump on any policy matters, any substantive matters in this administration. Many of them have been voting for Trump-approved bills, even despite their own articulated qualms or concerns about them. And yet, a number of Republicans have even teamed up with Democrats. There's a motion to have a discharge petition in the House if they come back after their month-long recess in September, and the documents still aren't released. There's an effort that's bipartisan, has a number of Republican co-sponsors as well as Democrats to force action on releasing these documents. And, again, this is the only thing that this handful of Republicans has been willing to openly defy Trump on. So I don't want to dismiss the significance, because I think it's real. However, I will say this. There have been concerns about Trump before among Republicans at many points along the way over this last 10 years. And because there's an absence of alternative, and then B, because they really hate Trump's critics more than they're concerned about Trump's own actions, in the end, they're likely to come back to him. And, overall, Donald Trump is a very unpopular, almost a historically unpopular president. I think we should underscore that and say that again and again, because he lies about it so much. I feel like even his critics sometimes accept his kind of false statements about where he stands with the American public. So let's be clear that Donald Trump, according to Gallup, just has now sunk to the worst ratings of his second term, and close to his worst ratings that he's ever had overall in Gallup polls. And he was a very, very unpopular president in his first term. And he is now sunk over the course of the first 6 months of his second term. His legislative initiative, the sort of tax cuts for the rich and spending cuts for everybody else bill is extremely unpopular, according to almost all surveys. And he struggled, as we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, to implement many of his sweeping and transformative, promises because they were based on false premises. And so, I think I see a presidency struggling in many ways, but one that is very, very adept at so far shaping a narrative of so much winning. And so we'll see, as reality hits in September, as we see whether the economy is really going to tank, as many economists, nonpartisan economists, fear. Does the Epstein thing define our politics? I don't think so. Does it further weaken a guy who's in trouble? Yeah, I think it probably does.
Yeah, well, that's the key point right there, because as you know, these days elections are won and lost on the margins, and we don't need MAGA to be destroyed. We need 3% of MAGA to just say, I've had it. And that could be a game changer. Susan, thanks for coming on and sharing your terrific insights. Do come back again.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a really great conversation.
All right. Take care.